The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath a canopy of stars on that September night in 1944, its surface reflecting the moonlight in a way that might have seemed peaceful to an untrained observer. But aboard the Japanese cruiser Ioba, there was nothing peaceful about the tension that hung in the air. Admiral Tezo Matsunaga had positioned himself on the bridge where he could feel the vibrations of the engines through the deck plating, a steady rhythm that had become almost meditative during the long hours of the voyage. The task force was making its way toward the Philippine Islands, and everything seemed to be proceeding according to plan. The convoy moved through waters that Japanese Naval Command still considered relatively secure, waters where American presence was thought to be minimal at best. Around him, staff officers went about their duties with the confidence that came from years of training and the deeply held belief that the Imperial Navy controlled these seas. They had assured Matsunaga repeatedly that enemy submarines posed little threat in this part of the ocean. According to their intelligence assessments, American underwater vessels operated primarily near their bases in Hawaii or down near the Australian coast. The vastness of the Pacific, they reasoned, made it impossible for the enemy to effectively patrol more than a fraction of its expanse. Japanese naval doctrine had always emphasized surface combat, the grand engagements between fleets of battleships and carriers that would determine the course of the war. Submarines were considered auxiliary weapons at best, useful perhaps for reconnaissance or the occasional harassment of enemy shipping, but not the kind of force that could fundamentally alter the strategic balance. This comfortable certainty lasted until the moment when the first torpedo found its mark. The cruiser, Miyoko, steaming in formation with the rest of the task force, suddenly erupted in a column of fire and water that seemed to reach toward the stars themselves. The explosion lifted the stern of the ship clear out of the ocean, metal screaming as it twisted and buckled under forces it was never designed to withstand. Men who had been standing watch moments before were thrown into the sea or crushed by collapsing structures. Matsunaga felt his world lurch as he gripped the railing, trying to process what his eyes were telling him. Before he could fully comprehend the disaster unfolding before him, another explosion split the night. The tanker Kachidoki Maru, laden with precious fuel oil, transformed into an inferno that turned the darkness into day. Flames leaped hundreds of feet into the air, fed by the thousands of tons of petroleum that now poured from ruptured tanks. Then came a third blast, this one claiming the destroyer Shikanami, her hull torn open by the force of the detonation. The Admiral stood frozen at the railing, his knuckles white as he tried to understand how this could be happening. These waters were supposed to be safe, far from known American patrol areas. How had the enemy found them here, in the middle of this vast ocean, under cover of complete darkness? The answer to his unspoken question came moments later when lookouts began shouting warnings. Another torpedo wake had been spotted, this one arrowing directly toward the Ioba herself. The characteristic trail of disturbed water and bubbles glowed faintly in the moonlight, marking the path of the weapon as it raced toward the flagship. Matsunaga realized in that instant that his fundamental understanding of the war had been wrong. The Americans were not confined to a few patrol zones. They were not limited by the distances involved. They were everywhere, lurking beneath the surface, striking when and where they chose. In the opening months of the conflict, Japanese naval planners had systematically underestimated the role that submarines could play in modern warfare. The great surface ships, the carriers with their complement of aircraft and the massive battleships with their enormous guns, these were viewed as the instruments that would decide the outcome. Submarines were relegated to secondary status, considered useful primarily for scouting ahead of the main fleet or perhaps launching the occasional opportunistic attack on merchant shipping. What no one in the Imperial Navy had anticipated was that this supposedly secondary weapon system, representing barely 6% of the total American naval strength, would ultimately account for the destruction of more than half of Japan's entire merchant marine. Beyond that, these underwater hunters would claim 1/3 of the Imperial Navy's warships, a toll that included 8 aircraft carriers and even the mighty battleship Congo, one of the most formidable vessels in the Japanese fleet. By the time 1945 arrived, the admirals who had once dismissed submarine warfare as a sideshow were desperately searching for countermeasures against an enemy that had effectively strangled their empire. The impact was comparable to the most intensive strategic bombing campaigns, yet it came not from the sky, but from beneath the waves. What made the submarine campaign so devastating was not any single catastrophic engagement, but rather the relentless, grinding nature of the assault. Day after day, week after week, month after month, Japanese ships disappeared beneath the surface of the Pacific. Each sinking represented not just the loss of the vessel itself, but the cargo it carried and the men who went down with it. Japan had entered the war with a merchant fleet totaling approximately 6 million tons of shipping capacity. This fleet formed the circulatory system of the empire, carrying vital resources from conquered territories back to the home islands. Oil flowed from the Dutch East Indies, where Japanese forces had seized control of rich petroleum fields. Rubber came from Malaya, where plantations produced the material essential for everything from vehicle tires to electrical insulation. Rice was shipped from Burma to feed both the civilian population and the military. Iron ore, bauxite, tin, and countless other raw materials travelled these same sea lanes. Without this constant flow of resources, the entire Japanese war machine would grind to a halt. The industrial base simply could not function without imported materials. There was no domestic source of petroleum. Rubber production within the home islands was negligible. Even food production could not keep pace with demand without imports from occupied territories. As American submarines began their campaign of systematic destruction, they targeted this vulnerable supply network with ruthless efficiency. Month by month, the tonnage of available shipping declined. Ships that were sunk could not be replaced at anything approaching the rate of loss. Japan's shipbuilding industry, already strained by the demands of constructing warships, could not produce merchant vessels fast enough to offset the losses. The empire, which had expanded across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, found itself slowly suffocating under the weight of this maritime blockade. The numbers behind this strangulation were almost incomprehensible in their magnitude. At the height of operations, the United States Navy maintained fewer than 300 submarines in active service across the entire Pacific theater. This relatively small force was tasked with patrolling an ocean that covers roughly 63 million square miles. By any conventional calculation, such a force should have been spread too thin to be effective. The sheer scale of the operating area should have provided Japanese shipping with enough room to maneuver and evade. Yet through a combination of innovative tactics, superior technology, and exceptional operational planning, American submarine crews managed to make the vast Pacific feel like a confined space with no room to hide. The transformation in effectiveness became particularly apparent during 1944, when submarine operations reached their peak intensity. In that single year, American submarines sent nearly 3 million tons of Japanese shipping to the bottom of the ocean. These were not just small coastal vessels or fishing boats, although those were targeted as well when found. The victims included large merchant ships, tankers laden with fuel, transports carrying troops and equipment, and even warships that had the misfortune to cross paths with a submerged hunter. Japan's capacity to replace such losses was virtually non-existent. The shipyards were working at maximum capacity and still falling further behind with each passing month. One aspect of this campaign that often goes overlooked in historical accounts is the fact that American submarines spent the first 18 months of the war operating under a severe handicap. The Mark 14 torpedo, the primary weapon carried by U.S. submarines at the start of the conflict, was fundamentally flawed in ways that undermined its effectiveness. These torpedoes had a tendency to run deeper than their set depth, passing harmlessly beneath the keels of target ships. Even when they did strike the target, the magnetic influence detonator often failed to trigger the explosion. In other cases, the contact detonator would activate prematurely, causing the torpedo to explode before reaching the target or to detonate on impact with such force that it shattered the detonator mechanism before the main explosive charge could fire. Submarine commanders found themselves in the frustrating position of achieving perfect attack positions, firing multiple torpedoes at sitting targets, and watching as weapon after weapon failed to achieve the desired result. They would hear the torpedo strike the hull of an enemy ship, only to see the vessel steam away undamaged. Japanese officers, observing these failures, began to ridicule American torpedoes as harmless duds, joking about the fish that could not swim straight and could not explode even when they hit their targets. For the submariners enduring this situation, the frustration was almost unbearable. They were risking their lives to get into firing position, expending precious torpedoes, and achieving nothing. The torpedo problems were eventually traced to multiple design flaws, including incorrect depth-keeping mechanisms, faulty magnetic detonators, and contact exploders that were too delicate for the forces involved in striking a ship's hull. Once these issues were identified and corrected, which finally happened in 1943, the results were immediate and dramatic. In that year alone, the tonnage of Japanese shipping destroyed by submarines doubled compared to the previous year. Suddenly, the weapons were performing as designed, and Japanese merchant captains who had grown complacent about American submarine attacks found themselves facing a vastly more lethal threat. The laughter stopped. Instead, Japanese sailors began to speak of the American submarines with genuine dread, knowing that an encounter with one of these vessels likely meant death. Technology played an increasingly important role as the war progressed and American forces refined their techniques. One of the most significant advantages enjoyed by US submarines was the SJ model surface search radar, a system that could detect ships on the surface from distances of 10 miles or more, even in complete darkness. This capability transformed night operations from a gamble into a calculated hunt. A submarine could surface after sunset, activate its radar, and track entire convoys without being seen. Japanese escort vessels, most of which lacked any radar capability at all, were operating blind by comparison. They relied on visual spotting, which meant that darkness provided them no protection against an enemy who could see through it with electronic eyes. American submarine commanders developed tactics that exploited this technological edge ruthlessly. They would detect a convoy on radar while still far beyond visual range, then maneuver into an optimal attack position using information that was completely unavailable to the enemy. Once in position, they could fire their torpedoes with mathematical precision, knowing exactly where the target ships were located and how fast they were moving. After launching their attack, they could dive beneath the surface and slip away before Japanese lookouts even determined which direction the attack had come from. For the defenders, the experience was nightmarish. Ships would suddenly explode without warning, erupting in flames while their escorts searched frantically for an enemy that had already vanished. Japanese destroyer captains, responsible for protecting convoys from submarine attack, found themselves completely outmatched by an enemy they could not see and could not track. One commander, in a report recovered after the war, complained bitterly about the impossibility of his mission. "The enemy always knows where we are," he wrote. "He attacks in fog, in rain, at night, whenever visibility is poor. He does not need sunlight to find us, but we need sunlight to find him." This fundamental asymmetry meant that escorts were reduced to making random depth charge attacks against suspected submarine positions, usually hitting nothing but empty water while the real threat maneuvered elsewhere. The psychological impact on Japanese merchant sailors grew more severe as losses mounted. Men who survived torpedoed ships told stories of watching convoy after convoy torn apart by unseen attackers. Sometimes 10 or more ships would be sunk in a single night, one explosion following another as submarines worked their way methodically through the formation. The terror of these experiences was compounded by the knowledge that there was essentially nothing the victims could do to defend themselves. They could not see their attackers. They could not effectively fight back. All they could do was wait and hope that the next torpedo was aimed at some other vessel. The cumulative effect of these experiences was predictable. Merchant ship captains began refusing assignments, claiming illness, or finding other excuses to avoid going to sea. Crews deserted in large numbers, preferring the risk of military punishment to the near certainty of death on a torpedoed ship. Manning the merchant fleet became increasingly difficult as the pool of willing sailors shrank. By 1944, the situation had become so desperate that Japan was reduced to transporting vital supplies in the most primitive ways imaginable. Oil, which had once moved in purpose-built tankers with capacity measured in thousands of tons, was now being carried in 55-gallon drums lashed to open barges. These makeshift vessels were painfully slow, vulnerable to even the smallest waves, and represented a catastrophic decline in transport efficiency. American submarine commanders, stalking these waters and identifying potential targets, sometimes found themselves looking at vessels so pathetic that they hesitated before firing. The target might be a small fishing boat pressed into service as a cargo carrier, or a wooden sailing vessel loaded with coal, barely seaworthy, and certainly no threat to anyone. Yet even these marginal targets contributed to the enemy war effort in some small way, and each one sunk tightened the noose around Japan's neck just a little bit more. Some submarines reported attacking sampans, traditional Chinese sailing vessels, because they were being used to move supplies between islands. Every link in the supply chain was a legitimate target, no matter how insignificant it might appear. The admirals of the Imperial Navy, trained in a doctrine that emphasized decisive fleet engagements and the overwhelming application of force in set-piece battles, found themselves unable to comprehend how such a small force could have such an outsized impact on their war effort. They thought in terms of battleships trading salvos at long range, of carrier groups maneuvering for position before launching airstrikes, of the grand tactical sweep that would annihilate the enemy fleet in a single climactic engagement. The submarine campaign fit none of these paradigms. It was patient, methodical, unglamorous, and devastatingly effective. There was no single moment of decision, no dramatic turning point where everything changed. Instead, there was a steady accumulation of losses that gradually strangled the empire. At staff meetings in Tokyo and other command centers, reports arrived daily detailing the latest shipping losses. Each report added to the growing catalogue of disasters. The tanker Azusa Maru, carrying 10,000 tons of precious aviation fuel, had been intercepted and sunk, her cargo now feeding flames on the ocean surface instead of powering aircraft engines. The transport, Lisbon Maru, with 700 soldiers packed aboard, had gone down with most of her passengers trapped below decks. The heavy cruiser Otago, flagship of Admiral Takeo Kurita, had been destroyed in minutes by the submarine USS Data, taking the Admiral's entire staff with her. Each loss was recorded, analysed, and added to the statistics that painted an increasingly grim picture. By late 1944, the cumulative effect of these losses had become impossible to ignore. Japanese fleet operations were being constrained not by enemy action at sea, but by the simple inability to obtain enough fuel to power the ships. The battleship Yamato, the largest and most powerful warship ever constructed, spent most of her operational life tied up in port because she consumed fuel at such a prodigious rate that High Command considered it wasteful to send her on routine missions. When she finally did sortie on what would be her final voyage, heading toward Okinawa in April 1945, she carried only enough fuel for a one-way trip. The plan called for her to beach herself and fight until destroyed, because there was no expectation that she would ever return to a friendly port. The mighty Yamato, symbol of Japanese naval power, reduced to a suicide weapon because submarines had cut off the oil supply. Another dimension of the submarine campaign that deserves more recognition is the role played by intelligence operations. American cryptanalysts had succeeded in breaking the Japanese naval code designated JN-25, which meant that US commanders often had advanced knowledge of convoy routes and schedules. Submarine patrol assignments could be made with the knowledge of exactly where Japanese ships would be traveling. Instead of having to search vast areas of ocean hoping to stumble across a target, submarines could position themselves along known routes and wait for the enemy to come to them. It was the maritime equivalent of a hunter sitting at a waterhole in the desert, knowing that prey would eventually have to come to drink. Japanese officers, unaware that their communications were being read by the enemy, struggled to explain the uncanny accuracy with which American submarines appeared at the right place and time. Some attributed it to luck. Others began to suspect that traitors were passing information to the Americans, perhaps through neutral countries or by radio. The possibility that their codes had been compromised was considered but ultimately dismissed by intelligence officers who had too much faith in their own cryptographic systems. The truth that virtually every significant naval message they sent was being read by enemy codebreakers would have been almost impossible for them to accept. The psychological impact of that knowledge might well have been devastating. The threat posed by American submarines extended far beyond merchant shipping. Major warships, the capital ships that represented years of construction effort and enormous investment of resources, proved just as vulnerable. In 1944, the submarine USS Albacore achieved one of the most significant kills of the entire war when she torpedoed the carrier Taiho. This was Japan's newest and most advanced carrier, incorporating all the lessons learned from earlier designs. She was considered virtually unsinkable, protected by extensive compartmentalization and damage control systems. Yet a single torpedo from Albacore started a chain of events that led to her destruction. Fumes from ruptured aviation fuel tanks accumulated in enclosed spaces, and when they ignited, the resulting explosion tore the ship apart from within. That same year, the submarine USS Kavala destroyed the carrier Shokaku, a veteran of the attack on Pearl Harbor and numerous other engagements. The loss of these carriers represented not just the destruction of the ships themselves, but the elimination of trained air crews and experienced personnel who could not be replaced. Perhaps most dramatically, the submarine USS Archerfish achieved what remains one of the most remarkable submarine kills in history when she sank the carrier Shinano. At over 72,000 tons displacement, Shinano was the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. She had been commissioned only 10 days before her final voyage and had not yet embarked an air group. She was being moved to a different port for final fitting out when Archerfish intercepted her. A spread of torpedoes found their mark, and within hours the giant vessel rolled over and sank, taking more than 1,000 men with her. These losses forced Japanese admirals to confront an uncomfortable reality. The carriers that formed the core of their naval power, the ships around which their entire doctrine was built, were not safe anywhere. A submarine lurking along a transit route could destroy a carrier just as easily as it could sink a merchant ship. The psychological impact of this realization was profound. Every time a major warship left port, there was the knowledge that somewhere beneath the surface an American submarine might be waiting. The ocean that had once seemed like Japan's domain had become hostile territory where danger lurked in every direction. The industrial and logistical machinery supporting the American submarine campaign was itself worthy of recognition. Each submarine required enormous quantities of fuel, spare parts, and torpedoes. The crews needed rest facilities, medical care, and provisions. All of this had to be delivered to advanced bases scattered across the Pacific. Yet the American supply system proved more than capable of meeting these demands. Major bases were established at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, at Fremantle in Australia, and later at captured islands including Guam and Saipan. These bases functioned with assembly line efficiency. When one submarine returned from patrol, it would be unloaded, resupplied, and given any necessary maintenance while the crew rested. Meanwhile, another boat would be preparing to depart, maintaining continuous pressure on Japanese shipping. Japanese attempts to develop effective anti-submarine warfare capabilities were hampered by resource shortages and technological limitations. Escort vessels were in chronically short supply because destroyer production had been prioritized for fleet operations rather than convoy defense. The few escorts that were available often lacked the sensors and weapons needed to effectively counter submarines. Sonar systems were primitive compared to American equipment. Depth charges were less powerful and less numerous than needed. Crews had not been trained extensively in anti-submarine tactics because the threat had been underestimated at the start of the war. By 1944, American submarines had refined their own version of wolfpack tactics, coordinating attacks with multiple boats striking a convoy simultaneously or in rapid succession. 3 or more submarines would communicate with each other, sharing information about convoy movements and coordinating their approaches. When the attack began, the convoy would often dissolve into chaos. Ships would scatter in different directions, some trying to run while others attempted to zigzag. This panic response usually made the situation worse as ships broke formation and became easier to target individually. Submarines could pick them off one after another, like wolves running down separated members of a herd. For the Japanese sailors caught in these attacks, the experience was utterly terrifying. Convoy voyages became exercises in sustained dread. Lookouts would strain their eyes scanning every quarter of the horizon, searching for periscope wakes or torpedo tracks. Depth charges would be dropped at irregular intervals, exploding in the water more as a way to calm nerves than because any submarine had actually been detected. Despite these precautions, the attacks continued. Men would find themselves in the water, clinging to wreckage and debris, watching as more torpedo wakes streaked toward other ships in the convoy. Some survivors described nightmares that persisted for years after the war, dreams of steel fish rising from the depths, invisible predators that could not be stopped or evaded. Admiral Shigeru Fukudomi, one of the senior commanders in the Imperial Navy, admitted after the war ended that they had simply had no answer to the submarine threat. His words captured the sense of helplessness that had gripped the Japanese naval command. "Our navy was defeated," he said, "not in the kind of battle we had trained for, but in silence, beneath the waves, by an enemy we rarely saw." This admission spoke to a fundamental failure of strategic planning. The Imperial Navy had prepared for one kind of war and found itself fighting another. All their training, all their doctrine, all their carefully hoarded resources had been optimized for surface engagements that never came while submarines bled them dry. Even civilians in Japan felt the effects of the submarine campaign, though most would not have understood the cause. By 1945, food shortages had become severe throughout the home islands. Rice rations, the staple of the Japanese diet, were cut repeatedly as imports from occupied territories dried up. Coal deliveries faltered, and cities experienced bitter cold during the winter months because there was not enough fuel for heating. Hospitals ran out of medicines, particularly the sulfanilamide drugs used to treat infections. Mothers were reduced to feeding their children whatever they could find: millet, acorns, even tree bark in the most desperate cases. The suffering was widespread and growing worse with each passing month. The root cause of this civilian hardship was the severing of maritime supply lines. The submarine campaign had cut off entire regions of the empire from the home islands. Manchuria, with its heavy industry and agricultural production, might as well have been on another planet for all the good it did Japan. The Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, all the territories that had been conquered at such cost, were now isolated and unable to ship their resources back to where they were needed. The Japanese High Command, still focused on achieving a decisive military victory that would turn the tide of the war, had failed to adequately protect the logistical networks that kept their economy functioning. American submarines had systematically severed those networks, link by link, until the entire system collapsed. The final statistics from the submarine campaign reveal its true magnitude and impact. Japan began the war with approximately 6,200 merchant ships of various sizes. American submarines sank more than 1,300 of them, representing over 20% of the total merchant fleet. In terms of major warships, the Imperial Navy lost roughly 350 vessels during the war. Of those, American submarines accounted for the destruction of more than 200, or approximately 60% of all Japanese warship losses, These numbers represented not just tactical victories, but strategic devastation. The Japanese economy and military machine depended on the ability to move resources by sea, and American submarines had destroyed that capability. The cost to the United States submarine force was significant but manageable. 52 submarines were lost during the course of the war, representing about 17% of the total submarine force. Approximately 3,500 submariners died in action, a casualty rate that was among the highest of any branch of the American military. Yet in exchange for these losses, the submarine force had crippled an entire empire. The mathematics of the exchange were brutal but clear. For every American submarine lost, Japanese losses included dozens of merchant ships, multiple warships, and thousands of tons of cargo that never reached its destination. By 1945, the Japanese admirals, who had once dismissed submarines as secondary weapons, were desperately searching for countermeasures that did not exist. They did not have enough destroyers to adequately escort their convoys. They did not have sonar systems sophisticated enough to reliably detect submerged submarines. They did not have radar that could match the American systems. They did not have the industrial capacity to replace losses as fast as they accumulated. The ocean, which had once served as the highway of the Japanese Empire, connecting far-flung conquests to the home islands, had been transformed into a graveyard where ships went to die. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, many of the senior officers who were interviewed about their experiences identified the submarine campaign as one of the most devastating aspects of the war. Some mentioned it even before the atomic bombings or the massive carrier raids that had destroyed Japanese cities. They had fought against an enemy they could rarely see, an opponent who struck without warning and disappeared without trace. The psychological burden of that kind of warfare was immense. Every voyage became a gamble with death. Every convoy that left port carried the knowledge that some percentage of the ships would never arrive at their destination. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who served as chief of the Naval General Staff, summarized the situation with painful clarity in his post-war statements. "We fought bravely," he acknowledged, "but we starved." The submarines were the unseen enemy, the force that destroyed our capacity to wage war without ever showing themselves in the kind of battle we had prepared for. This admission encapsulated the strategic failure that had doomed Japan. They had built a navy designed to win decisive fleet engagements, but the war was won and lost through attrition, through the patient, methodical destruction of the logistics that sustained the empire. For Admiral Matsunaga, standing on that pier in Manila in the days following the attack on his convoy, the memory of that September night remained vivid and painful. His flagship had survived, limping back to port with damage that would take weeks to repair. But half the ships in his convoy had been destroyed, sunk by an enemy that had appeared from nowhere and vanished just as mysteriously. As he watched oil from sunken tankers burning on the surface of the harbour, spreading sheets of flame across the water, he understood that something fundamental had changed. The Americans owned the sea, he thought. Not just the surface, but the depths beneath as well. There was nowhere left to hide. He was correct in that assessment. The American submarine force, never numbering more than 300 boats, had effectively transformed the vast Pacific Ocean into a cage. For the Empire of Japan, which had depended on maritime communications for its very survival, this cage became a death trap. Strangled from beneath the waves, cut off from the resources that sustained it, the empire slowly collapsed in on itself. The submarines had done their work silently, without the dramatic spectacle of surface battles or aerial bombardment, but with an efficiency and ruthlessness that proved impossible to counter. In the end, that silent campaign proved to be one of the most decisive elements of the entire Pacific War, a demonstration of how technology, tactics, and strategic planning could combine to achieve victory through means that had barely been imagined at the start of the conflict.